January 17, 1945. Guam, Mariana Islands. The morning air was thick with salt and heat. Beyond the barbed wire perimeter of Camp Holcomb, waves crashed against volcanic rock, a sound so constant it had become silence. Inside the compound, beneath canvas tarps stretched tight against the Pacific sun, a Japanese soldier named Corporal Hiroshi Tanaka sat cross-legged on swept earth, staring at the metal tray before him as though it were an apparition. Steam rose from mashed potatoes. Butter, rail butter, melted into golden pools. A slab of roasted beef, thick as a fist, rested beside canned peaches glistening in syrup. Coffee, black and bitter, sent its aroma curling through the humid air. Tanaka's hands, callous from years gripping the Arisaka rifle, trembled as they hovered over the fork. He had not eaten meat in 14 months. He had not seen butter in 3 years. For a man who had subsisted on weevil-infested rice and seaweed broth, who had watched comrades die with swollen bellies and bleeding gums, this tray was not a meal. It was an impossibility. Around him, other prisoners sat in similar paralysis. Some ate slowly, mechanically, as if the food might vanish if acknowledged. Others wept. One man vomited after his first bite, his stomach too shrunken to accept richness. A sergeant from the 31st Army refused to touch his tray for 2 days, convinced it was poisoned or a psychological trick designed to break his spirit before execution. The guards, American Marines with sunburned necks and cigarettes tucked behind ears, watched with expressions caught between pity and bewilderment. They did not understand why grown men cried over Spam. They could not comprehend that for these prisoners, this meal represented something far more devastating than kindness. It was evidence. Evidence that everything they had been told, everything they had believed, everything they had been willing to die for, was a lie. The mythology of sacrifice had sustained the Imperial Japanese Army through 4 years of brutal island warfare. From Guadalcanal to Saipan, from the jungles of New Guinea to the caves of Peleliu, Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to view deprivation as virtue. The military indoctrination system, rooted in centuries of samurai code and manipulated through modern propaganda, taught that suffering purified the spirit. Hunger was not a logistical failure, but a test of character. The sparse rations, often reduced to a single rice ball per day, occasionally supplemented with pickled radish or dried fish, were presented as evidence of Japanese spiritual superiority over the materialistic West. Officers reminded their men that American soldiers were soft, dependent on luxury, weakened by abundance. The Japanese warrior, by contrast, drew strength from deprivation. He needed nothing but his emperor's will and his own discipline. This narrative was reinforced through every channel of communication available to the imperial military apparatus. Newspapers published photographs of Japanese troops smiling over meager meals, accompanied by editorials praising their ascetic dedication. Radio broadcasts featured interviews with soldiers who claimed to prefer simple fare, describing rich foods as corrupting influences that dulled the warrior spirit. Training manuals explicitly connected dietary restraint to combat effectiveness, suggesting that a soldier who could survive on minimal rations possessed superior endurance and mental fortitude. But beneath this ideological framework lay a grimmer truth. Japan's supply lines had collapsed. The nation's merchant marine, once robust enough to sustain a far-flung Pacific empire, had been systematically destroyed by American submarines. By 1944, Japanese shipping tonnage had been reduced by 70%. Islands that had once received regular supply convoys now went months without resupply. Garrisons that had numbered in the thousands found themselves abandoned, left to forage in jungles already stripped of edible vegetation by previous occupants. Soldiers boiled tree bark. They ground insects into paste. They drew lots to determine who would receive the last handful of rice. Medical officers documented cases of beriberi, scurvy, and pellagra with clinical detachment, noting symptoms in journals they knew would likely never be read. Commanders issued orders forbidding the discussion of food, recognizing that hunger could demoralize faster than enemy fire. On Guadalcanal, Japanese troops had been reduced to eating grass and roots, while American forces a few miles away complained about the monotony of sea rations. On Saipan, civilians and soldiers alike had starved in caves while offshore. American supply ships unloaded crates of fresh fruit and frozen steaks. The soldiers had been taught that their suffering was shared equally by the enemy. They believed American troops were also hungry, also desperate, also sustained only by ideological fervor. This belief was essential to maintaining morale. If the enemy was equally deprived, then the contest became one of pure willpower, and Japanese soldiers had been assured since childhood that their willpower was unmatched. The concept of Yama Damashii, the spirit of Japan, was invoked constantly, a mystical quality that supposedly allowed Japanese warriors to overcome any material disadvantage through sheer determination. Surrender was portrayed not merely as cowardice, but as a betrayal of this transcendent spirit, a personal failure that would bring eternal shame not only to the individual, but to his family for generations. Better to die with honor than to live with the knowledge that one had proven spiritually inferior to the enemy. This was the lens through which Corporal Tanaka and thousands like him had viewed the world until the moment they became prisoners of war. Tanaka had been captured on January 9, 1945, during the American assault on the Central Highlands of Guam. His unit, the remnants of the 29th Division, had been ordered to conduct a final banzai charge against entrenched Marine positions. It was a suicide mission dressed in the language of honor. Officers had distributed the last sake rations and spoken of meeting at Yasukuni Shrine, where the spirits of fallen warriors were enshrined. Tanaka had written a farewell letter to his mother, apologizing for dying before he could see her again, expressing his joy at sacrificing himself for the emperor. The charge had begun at dawn, hundreds of men screaming as they ran toward machine gun fire, brandishing bayonets and swords, some carrying only bamboo spears. Tanaka remembered the sound, a collective roar that drowned out thought. He remembered the tracers, red lines cutting through morning mist. He remembered falling, a burning sensation in his left thigh. When he regained consciousness, American corpsmen were dragging him to an aid station. He had tried to resist, tried to complete his duty by dying, but his body would not obey. The morphine they injected made the world soft and distant. When he woke again, he was a prisoner. The shame had been immediate and absolute. He had failed his emperor, failed his ancestors, failed the spirit of Japan itself. For the first 3 days in the temporary holding facility near the beach, Tanaka had refused all food, expecting and hoping for execution. He had been taught that Americans tortured prisoners before killing them, that they were barbaric and cruel, that capture meant prolonged agony before death. Other prisoners shared these expectations. They huddled together, silent and awaiting their fate. But the execution did not come. Instead, they were given medical treatment. Tanaka's wound was cleaned, stitched, bandaged. He was given sulfa drugs and clean water. A doctor examined him with professional efficiency, communicating through a Nisei interpreter. The doctor asked about symptoms, about pain levels, about his medical history. It was routine and impersonal, the kind of care that assumed the patient's life had value. This, more than anything, had begun to crack Tanaka's certainty. When the prisoners were transferred to Camp Holcomb a week later, the fissures widened. The camp was clean. Barracks were swept daily. Latrines were maintained with lime and running water. Prisoners were issued soap, razors, toothbrushes, items that had become luxuries even for frontline Japanese troops. But it was the food that shattered the ideological framework entirely. That first breakfast, the tray with its impossible abundance, was not an anomaly. It was standard. Every meal followed the same pattern. Lunch brought sandwiches with real meat, canned vegetables, fruit. Dinner offered stew or roasted chicken, bread with margarine, dessert. The quantities were not lavish by American standards, but to men who had been starving, they represented obscene excess. More troubling still was the casualness with which it was provided. There were no lectures about American generosity, no demands for gratitude or political conversion. The guards simply delivered the food and walked away. It was policy, routine, unremarkable. This ordinariness was what made it devastating. Japanese military intelligence had prepared reports on American logistics, but these reports had been filtered through ideological assumptions that rendered them meaningless. Officers knew, in abstract terms, that American industrial capacity was vast. They knew the United States produced more steel, more oil, more vehicles than Japan. But this knowledge existed in a separate mental compartment from the daily reality of warfare. It was possible to acknowledge American material superiority while simultaneously believing it was a weakness, a dependence on machines and comfort that made American soldiers inferior in spirit and endurance. The propaganda reinforced this cognitive dissonance. Newsreels showed captured American equipment and presented it as evidence of waste and decadence. A Sherman tank was not a formidable weapon, but proof that Americans needed mechanical assistance because they lacked the warrior's heart. C rations were not efficient field sustenance, but symbols of softness, of soldiers who could not function without convenience. This narrative allowed Japanese commanders to accept casualty ratios of 10-1 and still claim victory, because spiritual superiority would ultimately prevail over material abundance. The prisoners at Camp Holcomb could no longer sustain this narrative. The food was too immediate, too tangible, too relentlessly consistent. After 2 weeks, Tanaka had gained 7 pounds. His wounds were healing cleanly, without infection. He had energy he had not felt in years. Other prisoners experienced similar transformations. Men who had been walking skeletons began to fill out. Skin regained color. Eyes lost their hollow stare. And with physical recovery came mental clarity, unwanted, unwelcome clarity. If American prisoners of war ate this well, what did American soldiers eat? If this was the minimum standard of care for captured enemies, what did that imply about American supply chains, about industrial capacity, about the fundamental material reality of the war? The questions accumulated like water behind a dam. Some prisoners attempted to maintain the old certainties. A lieutenant from the Guangdong Army organized a group that refused American food, eating only rice and vegetables, maintaining that accepting rich meals was a form of spiritual corruption. He lectured other prisoners about the importance of preserving Japanese values even in captivity. But his movement collapsed within a month. The body's need for nutrition was stronger than ideology. One by one, his followers returned to eating the full meals. The lieutenant himself eventually relented, sitting alone at a table with his tray, eating in silence, his face a mask of grief. What grieved him was not merely the personal failure of surrender, but the recognition that everything he had believed about American weakness was demonstrably false. If the enemy could feed prisoners this well while simultaneously conducting offensive operations across the Pacific, while bombing Japanese cities, while building new ships faster than submarines could sink them, then the war was not a contest of spirits, but a contest of systems, and Japan's system was failing catastrophically. The camp administrators, under directives from the War Department, followed Geneva Convention protocols meticulously. This was partly humanitarian concern, partly pragmatic calculation. Well-treated prisoners provided better intelligence. They were more willing to answer questions, more likely to cooperate with propaganda efforts aimed at demoralizing troops still fighting. But there was also a deeper strategic logic at work. American psychological warfare experts understood that the contrast between Japanese propaganda and American reality could be weaponized. Prisoners who experienced decent treatment became living contradictions to everything they had been taught. When these men were eventually repatriated, or when their letters were captured and distributed, their testimony could undermine Japanese morale more effectively than any bombing raid. The United States Office of War Information had studied the effects of cognitive dissonance in propaganda, drawing on research from social psychologists who had fled Europe. They understood that people who experienced evidence contradicting deeply held beliefs entered a state of psychological crisis. If managed correctly, this crisis could lead to ideological conversion. Corporal Tanaka experienced this crisis acutely. In his 4th week at Camp Holcomb, he was given permission to write a letter home, subject to censorship. He sat with paper and pencil, trying to find words that could explain his situation without admitting the depth of his shame. He could not tell his mother he had surrendered. He could not describe the food without implying criticism of Japan's conduct of the war. He settled on vague reassurances. He was alive. He was uninjured. He hoped she was well. The letter felt like a lie by omission. But what truth could he offer? That he ate better as a prisoner than he had as a soldier? That the enemy he had been taught to hate with religious fervor had treated his wounds with professional competence? That the Americans seemed neither cruel nor weak but simply organized, efficient, operating within a system so materially robust that feeding prisoners well was unremarkable policy. These truths were unwritable, unspeakable, yet they occupied his thoughts constantly. Other prisoners dealt with the cognitive dissonance differently. Some embraced complete conversion, volunteering to assist American intelligence, providing detailed information about Japanese defenses and troop movements. These men were rare and viewed with contempt by other prisoners, but their existence demonstrated the psychological power of the experience. More common were prisoners who entered a state of numb acceptance, refusing to think deeply about implications, existing day to day in a kind of emotional suspension. They ate the food, followed camp routines, avoided discussing the war or politics. It was a survival strategy, a way to defer the difficult work of reconciling belief with evidence. But even for these men, the evidence accumulated. The camp library contained American magazines, Life, Time, National Geographic. Prisoners could see photographs of American cities, factories, farms. They could read articles about war production, about shipyards launching new carriers every month, about aircraft factories producing bombers in assembly line precision. The images showed abundance that seemed almost fantastical. Grocery stores with shelves stocked floor to ceiling. Restaurants with menus offering dozens of choices. Families eating meals that would have fed an entire Japanese platoon. Was this propaganda, exaggeration, staged photography? Some prisoners insisted it must be. But the food on their trays suggested otherwise. If this was the baseline, the minimum, what did the maximum look like? By March 1945, Camp Holcomb held over 2,000 Japanese prisoners. The population included soldiers from across the Pacific Theater, veterans of campaigns in China, the Philippines, New Guinea, the Solomons. In the evenings, men gathered in small groups to share stories, to compare experiences. A private from the 18th Army described eating tree bark on New Guinea while watching American planes drop supply canisters that included ice cream makers. A sergeant from the Philippines told of finding an abandoned American field kitchen that still contained enough canned goods to feed his platoon for a week. Rations the Americans had simply left behind during a tactical withdrawal, too minor to bother retrieving. These stories circulated like contraband, whispered evidence of a material disparity so vast it seemed to belong to different wars, different worlds. The emotional impact was complex. There was envy, certainly. Anger at Japanese leadership for sending men into battle without adequate supplies. Grief for comrades, who had starved unnecessarily. But there was also something deeper and more disturbing. A growing sense that the war had been unwinnable from the beginning, that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome such fundamental imbalance. The symbolism of food had always been central to Japanese military culture. Rice, in particular, carried profound cultural weight. It was the foundation of Japanese civilization, the sacred crop blessed by the sun goddess Amaterasu. Sharing rice was an act of communion. A soldier's ration of rice connected him to the homeland, to his family, to centuries of tradition. When supplies dwindled and rice became scarce, the psychological impact was devastating. Officers reported that men could endure injuries, fatigue, even high casualties, but the absence of rice broke morale in ways combat could not. Substitute foods, sago palm, yams, wild grains, were nutritionally adequate but spiritually empty. They were survival, not sustenance. This cultural relationship with food made the abundance at Camp Holcomb even more psychologically complex. The meals were not just nourishment, but proof that the enemy operated in a different paradigm entirely, one where food was functional rather than sacred, produced industrially rather than grown with ancestral care. American agricultural and industrial capacity was indeed operating on a scale that contemporaries struggled to comprehend. By 1945, the United States was producing 40% of the world's armaments, while simultaneously maintaining civilian living standards higher than pre-war levels. Farms fed not only American troops and civilians, but also Allied forces across the globe through Lend-Lease. Victory gardens and rationing were implemented, but these were minor inconveniences rather than genuine deprivations. Most Americans never experienced hunger during the war. They experienced menu restrictions, less beef, less sugar, but not caloric insufficiency. This abundance was not accidental but the result of systematic investment in agricultural science, mechanization, transportation infrastructure, and industrial organization stretching back decades. The United States had developed economies of scale that allowed it to feed its military personnel significantly better than most nations fed their civilians. A typical American soldier's daily ration provided approximately 4,000 calories, with attention paid to nutritional balance, variety, and even palatability. Menus were designed by dietitians. Recipes were tested. The military invested in research to make field rations more appetizing, understanding that well-fed soldiers performed better, fought harder, recovered faster. Japanese logistics, by contrast, had collapsed under the weight of strategic overextension and material shortages. The decision to expand the war into China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific simultaneously had stretched supply lines beyond sustainability. Japan's industrial base, roughly 10% the size of America's, could not produce enough ships to transport adequate supplies, could not manufacture enough trucks to distribute those supplies inland, could not generate enough fuel to run the vehicles it did have. These were not failures of willpower, but mathematics. By 1944, some Japanese garrisons in the Pacific were completely cut off, receiving no supplies at all, forced to become self-sufficient on islands with minimal arable land. Commanders issued orders for soldiers to grow their own food, to fish, to forage. Troops who had trained as infantrymen became farmers, tending small gardens carved from jungle, growing sweet potatoes and vegetables to supplement vanishing rice rations. It was a losing battle. Tropical diseases, pest infestations, and poor soil defeated many agricultural efforts. Men worked harder and grew hungrier. When garrison populations were large, they stripped the local environment faster than it could regenerate, creating ecological collapse that accelerated starvation. The prisoners knew these realities intimately. They had lived them. But experiencing American abundance recontextualized their suffering. It had not been noble sacrifice, but unnecessary waste, the result of strategic failures at the highest levels of command. This realization bred resentment. In quiet conversations, prisoners began to question decisions made by generals and politicians who had never missed a meal, who had sent hundreds of thousands of men to die or starve on remote islands while they dined in Tokyo. The traditional deference to authority, so central to Japanese military culture, began to erode. This erosion was visible in small acts of defiance, prisoners questioning camp rules, arguing with guards, refusing to participate in work details not because of principle, but from sheer irritation. The American guards, accustomed to a military culture that allowed for significantly more individual expression, often misread these incidents as personal conflicts rather than the collapse of an ideological system. In May 1945, the camp received a new group of prisoners from Okinawa. These men arrived in worse condition than previous groups, many suffering from severe malnutrition, untreated wounds, and psychological trauma. The battle for Okinawa had been apocalyptic, grinding urban combat that killed over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and an estimated 100,000 Okinawan civilians. Survivors described caves packed with wounded, no morphine, no bandages, only sake to dull pain. They described children starving, elderly civilians choosing suicide rather than burden families with one more mouth to feed. They described officers hoarding food while enlisted men ate grass. When these prisoners encountered the food at Camp Holcomb, the psychological impact was even more extreme. Several suffered complete mental breakdowns. One man became catatonic, staring at his tray without blinking, tears running down his face in silence. A lieutenant attacked a guard, not with intent to escape, but in a kind of suicidal fury, screaming that he wanted to be shot, that he deserved to die for his failure. The camp psychiatrist, a major who had studied at Johns Hopkins before the war, wrote in his report that these men were experiencing a form of moral injury, the psychological wound that occurs when one's experiences violate deeply held beliefs about justice and meaning. Corporal Tanaka tried to help the new arrivals, tried to ease their transition, but found his own beliefs too unstable to offer convincing comfort. What could he say? That the food was real, that the Americans meant no harm, that the war was nearly over. All true, but insufficient. The new prisoners asked questions Tanaka had asked himself and failed to answer. Why had they been told Americans were cruel when they were not? Why had they been sent to fight without adequate food or ammunition? Why had commanders ordered suicidal charges instead of strategic withdrawals that might have saved lives? Tanaka had no answers that did not indict the entire system he had served. The silence between question and response grew heavy with implications. By summer, the camp had organized educational programs for prisoners. American instructors taught English, basic civics, vocational skills intended to prepare prisoners for post-war repatriation. The instructors were carefully selected, Nisei interpreters, academic specialists, officers trained in cultural sensitivity. They had been instructed to avoid direct criticism of Japan or aggressive promotion of American ideology. The goal was subtle, allowing prisoners to reach their own conclusions through exposure to information. Classes included history lessons that presented the war from American and neutral perspectives, economic lectures explaining industrial production and agriculture, political discussions about democracy and governance. These sessions were voluntary, but attendance was high. Prisoners were hungry for understanding, for explanations that made sense of their experiences. Some attended seeking to confirm that American information was propaganda, hoping to find obvious lies they could reject. Instead, they found data, statistics, photographs, maps, evidence that was difficult to dismiss. One lecture on American agricultural mechanization showed footage of combine harvesters processing wheat, a single machine doing the work of hundreds of laborers. A prisoner who had been a farmer in Hokkaido watched in silence, then asked, through the interpreter, how many such machines America possessed. The instructor consulted notes. Approximately 190,000 combines operating in the United States as of 1943. The prisoner nodded slowly, calculating. The machine he had just watched could harvest his family's entire annual crop in less than an hour. Multiply that by 190,000. Multiply that abundance across all crops. The numbers became incomprehensible, yet the evidence was there on the screen. The symbolic power of food continued to dominate prisoner consciousness even as the war ground toward its conclusion. When news reached the camp that Germany had surrendered in May, prisoners understood that Japan now faced the full weight of Allied power alone. Discussions turned to endgame scenarios. Some prisoners believed Japan would fight to national extinction, that the homeland would become one vast Okinawa, every civilian armed with bamboo spears, every city reduced to rubble. Others hoped for negotiated peace, though none could articulate what terms Japan might offer from a position of complete strategic collapse. The question underlying all these discussions was simpler and more terrible. Had it all been for nothing? The years of war, the millions of dead, the starvation and suffering, had any of it been necessary, or had it been the foreseeable consequence of decisions made by leaders who refused to acknowledge reality? On August 6th, news reached Camp Holcomb that a new type of bomb had destroyed Hiroshima. Details were scarce, reports confused, but the scale of destruction was clear. The camp fell silent. Prisoners gathered around radios, listening to American broadcasts, struggling to comprehend what atomic bomb meant. 3 days later, Nagasaki. Then, on August 15th, the Emperor's radio address announcing Japan's surrender. The broadcast was played over the camp's loudspeaker system. Many prisoners had never heard the Emperor's voice before. The formal, archaic language was difficult to parse, but the meaning was unmistakable. The war was over. Japan had been defeated. Prisoners reacted in diverse ways. Some wept. Others sat stone-faced. A few expressed relief. The killing would stop, families might survive. But most experienced a kind of emotional paralysis, unable to process the totality of the moment. Corporal Tanaka listened to the broadcast sitting on the ground outside his barracks, knees drawn to chest, staring at nothing. He thought about his mother, about his village in Yamaguchi Prefecture, about the men from his unit who had died in the Banzai charge. He thought about the tray of food that had started his crisis of belief. The Emperor spoke of enduring the unendurable, bearing the unbearable. Tanaka understood this was not metaphor but description. In the weeks following surrender, the camp's atmosphere changed. Prisoners were no longer enemies, but simply defeated soldiers awaiting repatriation. The formalities of guard procedures relaxed. Some Americans began to interact with prisoners as individuals, sharing cigarettes, showing photographs of home, asking questions about Japan. A Marine guard from California told Tanaka, through an interpreter, that his parents owned a produce farm and employed Japanese immigrant workers before the war. The guard had grown up around Japanese culture, knew fragments of the language, held no personal animosity. He asked Tanaka what he would do when he returned home. Tanaka had no answer. Return to what? A country in ruins, an economy destroyed, a belief system shattered? The guard seemed to understand the silence, nodding slowly. He offered Tanaka a cigarette. They smoked together without speaking, two men who had been trying to kill each other a year earlier, now simply existing in the same defeated space. Repatriation began in October 1945 and continued through 1946. Prisoners were processed in groups, given medical examinations, issued documents, transported to ports for the journey home. Corporal Tanaka's turn came in January 1946, exactly 1 year after his first meal at Camp Holcomb. Before departure, prisoners were allowed to take certain personal items. Tanaka had accumulated few possessions, some books, letters, a notebook in which he had started writing observations he could not send home. He was also given a final meal, the same standard fare he had eaten hundreds of times. steak, potatoes, vegetables, bread, coffee. He ate slowly, aware that this might be the last time he consumed meat for years. Japan was starving. Reports from the homeland described food shortages worse than anything experienced during the war. Rationing was severe. Black markets thrived. American occupation authorities were shipping in food aid, but it was insufficient. Tanaka knew he was returning to hunger. The irony was not lost on him. He would eat better as a prisoner of war than as a liberated citizen. This inversion of expectations had become the defining fact of his war experience. The voyage back to Japan took 2 weeks aboard a converted troop transport. The ship was crowded, conditions basic but adequate. Prisoners were given rations, condensed foods, crackers, canned goods. Still more than many of them had eaten as soldiers. During the journey, men talked endlessly, processing their experiences, trying to construct narratives that made sense. Some blamed military leadership, arguing that Japan's high command had been criminally negligent. Others blamed politicians, industrialists, the system itself. A few still defended the war as necessary, arguing that even in defeat Japan had demonstrated its spiritual courage, that the atomic bombs proved Americans needed technological supremacy because they lacked moral strength. These arguments convinced few. Most prisoners had moved beyond ideology to a simpler, more pragmatic understanding. Japan had fought a war it could not win against an enemy it did not understand, and the price had been catastrophic. The food they had eaten as prisoners was not incidental to this understanding but central to it. It was the daily, tangible proof that American power was not military might alone, but systemic, industrial, agricultural, organizational, a form of strength that permeated every level of society. The ship docked in Yokohama Harbor on January 29, 1946. Prisoners filed off the transport into a country transformed by defeat. The port area was damaged but functional, American efficiency already visible in reconstruction efforts. Military police directed traffic, engineers supervised repairs, supply convoys moved with organized precision. Tanaka and other returning prisoners were processed through repatriation centers, given travel documents, small amounts of yen, and information about family notification procedures. Then, they were released into the ruins of their homeland. Tanaka walked through Yokohama toward the train station, moving through a landscape of rubble and makeshift shelters. People looked thin, worn, moving with the careful economy of motion that characterizes malnutrition. Children begged. Women sold possessions for food. American soldiers distributed chocolate bars to crowds of kids. The occupation was everywhere: jeeps, checkpoints, signs in English. Japan had become someone else's country. He boarded a train to Hiroshima, wanting to see the city that had been erased, needing to witness the physical reality of Japan's defeat. The journey took 2 days, trains running sporadically, tracks still being repaired. When he arrived, what struck him was not the destruction. He had seen destroyed cities before, but the totality. Hiroshima had not been bombed, it had been deleted. The city center was a flat expanse of ash and debris. Concrete buildings stood as hollow shells. Trees were charred black. The Ai Bridge, the bomb's target point, still stood but surrounded by nothing, a bridge to nowhere. People lived in shacks built from scraps, cooking over small fires, their faces blank with exhaustion. Tanaka walked through the ruins for hours, feeling the winter wind cut through inadequate clothing, smelling the lingering scent of smoke and dust. This was the alternative to surrender. This was what unconditional resistance would have brought to every Japanese city. He thought about the prisoners who had believed Japan should fight to national extinction, who had argued that surrender was unthinkable shame. He thought about the tray of food, the impossible abundance, the systemic power it represented. The atomic bomb was that same power concentrated in a single moment. America could afford to be generous to prisoners because America could afford anything. From Hiroshima, he traveled to his family's village in Yamaguchi. The journey required multiple trains, a bus, and finally walking, the road still primitive and poorly maintained. He arrived after dark, exhausted, wearing donated clothes too thin for winter cold. His mother answered his knock, her face showing shock, disbelief, then overwhelming joy. She had received notification of his capture and survival, but had not known when or if he would return. She looked older, thinner, the war years visible in her posture and hands. Inside, the house was cold. Fuel was scarce. She offered him tea and rice, apologizing for the meager portions. The rice was mixed with barley to stretch supplies. There were pickles but no fish, no meat, no vegetables beyond what she had preserved from a small garden. Tanaka ate slowly, savoring his mother's cooking despite its simplicity, aware that this meal represented a significant sacrifice on her part. She had saved these rations for his return. He did not tell her about the steak and potatoes. He did not describe the American camp's abundance. How could he explain that her carefully saved rice, offered with such love, was less than what he had received as an enemy prisoner? The knowledge sat in his chest like a stone.